we've made it to chapter 12, which chapters 12 and 13 are really some of the more interesting, well, I won't say more interesting, but I mean, I think, some of the stuff that people have gotten little bits and pieces out of, and a lot of times you'll hear, for chapters 12 and 13, you'll hear different things about, one world, economies, and all these things. And even though there is a little bit of that in there, it's always talked about as though it's just a future event, like we're waiting on this stuff to happen. Well, again, if you understand it in the context, then this stuff was already happening in their day, in the first century. And so that's one of the things I like about doing the study is that it again, like I said from the very beginning, if you have a few interpretive keys, right, some background information, some context, it really brings these chapters to life. So today, again, 12 and 13 are some of my favorite chapters, just because it deals with the beasts and the dragons, and it seems, when you read it, it seems so cryptic, and like I have no idea what this means as far as, it's what it sounds like. But once you get those interpretive keys, it'll make it at least closer. Again, I get that all this is very complicated, and I would never in a million years want you to come away from here thinking, "God, I can't believe he understands all this stuff." It takes lots and lots and lots of study every week, and study that I've done in the past, because I've taught this several times. So in other words, it's not like I just inherently know this stuff. So it's complicated. So again, if you get anything from it, that's good, right? And it should lead to further study. So what we're going to do to start out with is I'm going to do a little different than I usually do it. I want to go ahead and read this first section together without stopping, so that we can kind of get a feel for it, and then we'll go back and we'll read it. So if you'll remember from last week, I said that we would start with 11:19, because technically that should go with chapter 12. So on that note, all of your Bibles have section headings. Each of those sections we call a pericope, right? And so it's a section, right? And so your Bibles probably supply you with section headings, and then like here it probably says something like, the woman and the dragon, or something, whatever it says in there. And then of course you have chapter numbers and verse numbers and all that stuff. Well, please note that wasn't put in there until way later. So right before the King James Version was released in 1611, somebody actually supplied those chapter numbers and verse numbers, and they are absolutely helpful for understanding. But when you look at the sections and stuff, sometimes it doesn't fit exactly, because it's just section numbers and stuff, chapters and verses that were added way later on. And so the original didn't have that. As a matter of fact, it's fascinating. If you actually look at a Greek text of the New Testament, there aren't even any spaces. Like there's no punctuation. There's no spaces between the Greek words and stuff. It is just Greek letters, and they just run together. And so back then, of course, only educated people would have been able to read, and so they just knew. When you look at it, it's kind of like that paper, if you've seen it, where it's like a paragraph, and they have all the words. They have the first letter and the last letter of each word, but all the middle letters are jumbled up, and you look at it and you can read it just normally, because your brain is used to working all that out. And so as long as the first letter and the last letter are there, the middles can be jumbled up, and you can, in the context, you can still read it. Well, that's how Greek readers would have been. It just Greek letters across the page, and then they would just be able to read it. So these chapter numbers, so sometimes like when you get a situation like this, it's just because when they originally did it, it doesn't coordinate exactly, right? So if you ever think, this should have gone with the next section, well, maybe so. You might be right. All right, so starting at 11:19. Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to the male child, one who is to rule the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Let's see, I think we're going through 6, yeah. And the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days, okay? So there's a lot of information there. We've got the woman. We need to figure out who's the woman. I think even if you don't know who the woman is and the whole dragon thing is a little confusing, I think you can kind of get an idea of who the child is, right? So we'll go through and explain each part, but I kind of wanted to go through that whole first section without stopping, because I think sometimes we lose the context of it. Okay, so note, then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen with his temple. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail, right? So again, when we have these scenes of God on the throne and on Mount Sinai, and when God appears, we often have rumblings of thunder and all of that, and so that's just kind of a theophany, right, where you have God. And then note, we were talking earlier, we talked about the temple that was symbolic of the church, right? And so here you have the heavenly temple opened up, right? And so that's right after we talked about the temple of believers, right? And then note, the Ark of his covenant is there as well. And so you have the Ark of the covenant was taken into battle at different times, and so that was kind of a sign of God's being with his people and all of that. So then you get to 12:1, where it starts getting deep. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Okay? Now this is not a test to see that you don't know it or whatever. I'm just curious, because in a minute you're going to know exactly what this means. How many of you know already? And we have done this before. I did this on a Wednesday. I did part of this on a Wednesday. How many of you know what this is talking about? Raise your hand if you know what this is talking about. Beautiful. Because in just a second, you're going to know exactly what it's talking about. All right, so we want to know who the woman is, clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And look, the interpretive key is found way back in Genesis 37. Where Joseph has his, I believe it's his second, it says second dream, right? It says, then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? So that is the interpretive key. Who is this woman? She is Israel. She is faithful Israel, because that's what the woman or what the dream meant. So you had the sun and the moon were Jacob and Rachel, sorry. And then you had, Rebecca or Rachel? Rachel, right? Jacob and Rachel and Isaac and Rebecca. Or am I getting, anyway, whatever. So Jacob, right? And then you have the brothers, right? The 12 tribes, even though obviously one is missing because Joseph is the one dreaming it. So they equal the 12 tribes. And so this picture here is of Israel. And so it's going to represent all believers of all time, because of obviously here you're talking about Israel. But then in the New Testament, again, as we've talked about before, all of the promises that were given to Israel in the Old Testament are given also to the church of believers in the New Testament in the book of Revelation. And again, it is not a replacement theology. It is not, okay, the Jews didn't do what they were supposed to do, so therefore they are out and this Gentile church is in. It is simply those who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, those people are Israel, right? That's just the point. So just as you could convert to Judaism in the Old Testament and throughout the New Testament period, it's the same thing. These people are basically converted to Judaism, and they just don't have to follow the food laws and stuff because, again, that stuff is out with Jesus. So the woman equals faithful Israel. She is to be contrasted with the harlot who is Babylon at 17:5. So here she represents Israel, or faithful Israel, which includes the New Testament church. And then the harlot is going to be Babylon, i.e. Rome, i.e. the empire, or whatever group is trying to get you to not worship God. There are also hints here, though, for way back to Genesis 3:15 and the conflict between the serpent and Eve's offspring. If you'll remember, it says this, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. And note that this is going to be specifically pointed out when we get to verse 9. But you have the dragon, i.e. Satan, and then the woman and the church and the Messiah all there. And so there's a battle back and forth. And so that's what the symbols represent. And we'll get more into that as we go. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. Note, interestingly, too, that birth pains and childbearing were one of the results of the fall, right, in Genesis 3. And so, it says that the birth pains would be multiplied. And so here it's described in that similar way. Note that additionally, where Christians suffer in bearing witness to Christ, here the woman suffers in giving birth to Christ, right? And so it's suffering on both sides. So then at 12:3, and another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. Okay? So there is, throughout the Old Testament, we have dragon imagery and such. And part of the problem with that is that we have several words that are used for dragons. When we think of dragons today, we think of like Lord of the Rings dragons, The Hobbit and, dragons like that. Dragons and serpents were interchangeable in the ancient world, and usually they came from the sea. They're sea monsters, as far as when we talk about dragons. So early on we have, and this is throughout the ancient world, so in Gentile belief, okay, you had in north of Israel, you had this place called Ugarit, right? And their language is called Ugaritic, okay? And so in Ugaritic, you had a sea monster called Lotan, right? And it's the meaning of that is the twisting one, or also referred to Yam. The name of Lotan is Yam sometimes. Yam means sea. So basically, Lotan is a sea creature, right? It is a sea serpent. If you look at one of the myths about the sea serpent, it says this. I have it on there. This is from the Baal cycle, what we call the Baal cycle. So, when you look at the Old Testament and you see all this information about Baal and all of these pagan gods and stuff, well, you can go and you can get those texts. Because thankfully in, I think it was 1918 or maybe 1928, Ugarit was discovered. And so they discovered Ugarit and they found this huge library of texts. And so you can go back and you can read what they believed about Baal and what they believed about Ashtoreth and all of these different gods and goddesses and such. And so again, it supplies background to the Old Testament, right? It's stuff that, you get these gods and such named in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, but you don't really get the whole understanding, right? So when it talks about, for instance, when we talk about that it's an abomination to sacrifice to Chemosh or to Molech, and you don't know who Chemosh or Molech are, well, we have those texts about Chemosh and Molech, and we find that how do you sacrifice to Chemosh and Molech? Well, you sacrifice your children, right? And so that supplies background. And so when you read that the Israelites are sacrificing to Chemosh or Molech in the Old Testament, you can say, oh, they were sacrificing their children, right? And so again, these texts provide us with important background. So note the language here. When you smite Lotan, the fleeing serpent, finish off the twisting serpent, the close coiling one with 7 heads, right? So notice that the serpent is a dragon with 7 heads, right? You have a similar dragon in the Old Testament. Very similar, actually. Note that Isaiah 27:1 says, "In that day the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea." Right? So in the Old Testament, you have a similar dragon referred to as Leviathan, okay? And I know it's you have to look at it in Ugaritic, the Ugaritic language, which is a Semitic language somewhat related to Hebrew. If you look at it in Hebrew and Ugaritic, Lotan and Leviathan are very similar, right? So it's the actual word is similar. You also get in the Old Testament serpents and dragons referred to as Tannin, and then sometimes the serpent is referred to as Rahab. Usually it's referred to Rahab when we're using the serpent to represent a nation, like, for instance, Egypt. And so there are places in the Old Testament where Egypt is referred to Rahab, and Rahab is the serpent Leviathan. 74:14. You crushed the heads, notice plural, of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. Okay, so note that the language between the two, you have multiple heads, you have the fleeing serpent, you have the twisting serpent, right? It is a similar idea, and what this beast represents, or what the serpent or the dragon represents, is the chaos waters, right? And Russ, when he talked about Daniel, he talked about this a little bit. And so they looked at Leviathan and Lotan as a chaos monster that comes out of the oceans, because that was the one frontier that they had not really dealt with much, was the oceans and the deep waters, because they just didn't know what was there. And you get all these places where God conquers the waters, and the whole point of that, and he controls the waters at the Exodus, the whole point there is that even God can control the waters. Note that Jesus can walk on waters, right? And so that's a big deal in the ancient world, because the waters were seen as uncontrollable, and that you just can't deal with those. And so all those places where it talks about God controlling the waters and all of that, that shows that God is over all of creation. Because again, for us, we're not really scared of that, even though I'm scared of sharks in the ocean. But, we're not really scared of that today, because we know what's in the ocean pretty much. And that's why I'm scared of the ocean. But we know what's there, but they did not, right? So it's not until relatively modern times, in the last 100 or so years, that we really kind of even understood the oceans that much. Note that this is no crocodile, right? So there are translations that will refer to Leviathan as a crocodile. Well, crocodiles don't have multiple heads. Okay, and so it's not a crocodile. It is just a representative symbol of this dragon monster chaos. And if you look up Leviathan in the Old Testament, you'll see it, because it's all the different places. It clearly refers to a dragon-type monster. Note that John associates this serpent / dragon / Satan, because that's what this dragon is. It represents Satan, with the serpent who brought spiritual death by enticing Adam and Eve to disobey God, right? And so note that in this we call it a dragon, but in Genesis it's referred to as a serpent. But again, that the English belies that. It's the same thing, and it's used interchangeable between the dragon and the serpent. And so dragon and serpent are similar, synonymous ideas. Notice that the serpent will now enlist the beast, right, which is going to basically symbolize the empire, to get Christians to disobey God by forcing them to worship the emperor and pagan gods, like the serpent did in Genesis, right? It got Eve to basically question God, and whether she might rather do her own thing. And listen, we always give Eve a bad rap, because it's like, well, Eve did it, and then somehow she went and tricked Adam and was like, hey, I found this fruit. Well, just for the record, if you go back and read the Genesis account, it says that she gave some to her husband, gave some to Adam, who was with her. So he's there the whole time, right? So he was there, and he could have said, hey, you know what? This is not a good idea. So I'm just saying, let's not be down on the women. Note that in Daniel 7, 2 through 8, and I didn't put them all in here, there were 4 beasts with a total of 7 heads, with the fourth beast having 10 horns, right? And so basically what I'm saying here is that all of the beasts of Daniel are put together in one beast, and it's an amalgamation of all the beasts all one. So it's one really big bad empire. Note that horns represent power, and note that kings wore diadems. And diadems are basically like these headbands, and these headbands are specifically to be contrasted with the star headband that the woman wears, right? So again, understand that all of this is symbolic. It's all symbols, and so that's why it's pictures. Remember, we talk about the book, and we talk about it as pictures. All of these are pictures. They are to put images in your head, scary images, to make you see it and feel for it, right? It's not so, I mean, clear. These aren't literal, and we're actually about to get right there in a minute where it clearly says that it's not literal. But not only is there a background for the actual dragon creature itself, which is, again, it's got an Old Testament background and a larger Near Eastern background, but this whole story of the woman and the dragon also has a background. And note that there are several, actually, and please understand that there are several backgrounds for all of this, but I'm trying to just give you some of them that are representative to show you that clearly these things aren't just, they're not new. They're ideas that have been already floating around. And so what John does is he re-visualizes these ideas to refocus pagan myths and different things like that to where they're Christocentric, right? And so they point to Christ and they point away from these pagan myths that everyone is familiar with. Note that all of the gods that we talk about, they worship in Asia Minor. And so this is not like foreign to them as it is foreign to us today. When we look at it today, we say, well, I don't know about all that. Well, that's because it's foreign to us, and we don't think about worshiping other gods generally, particularly like these gods. But they absolutely did then, and clearly, again, from the letters to the churches at the beginning in chapters 2 and 3, clearly that's a problem that they had, is that they were worshiping false gods. And so that's why it's all written in this way. It's to turn the focus from the pagan religions to the object of worship, which should be Jesus and God, right? So there is a Greek version of a Egyptian myth where you have Isis, and it's not the terrorist group ISIS. It is Isis and Osiris. Isis is pictured with the sun on her head, and she gives birth to a son, Horus. A red dragon called Typhon attempts to slay her before she gives birth, and she escapes to an island, right? She escapes, she gives birth to Horus, and then Horus goes and defeats the dragon. There is a Roman version of this same myth where Zeus gets a lady named Leto pregnant, right? His wife, in one of the versions, his wife Hera sends a dragon who's called Python to kill Leto, right? Because she's going to give birth, and so she's like, "Well, I don't want her to have, my husband's child," right? So, in another version, Python goes to kill Leto because he finds out that her child is going to be the one who slays him. And so he obviously doesn't want to be killed, and so he's going to go and he's going to kill Leto so she doesn't give birth. In the Roman version, Poseidon, who is the god of the sea, hides her on an island, and then he submerges that island, right? And somehow he makes her breathe and everything. And then she gives birth to Apollo and Artemis. Note that Apollo and Artemis, as well as Isis and Osiris and Horus, are all worshipped in Asia Minor. So they would have been very familiar with all of these stories, right? When Leto gives birth to Apollo and Artemis, the twins, Apollo goes after he's 4 years old, because it took him a little while to get his strength up, 4 days. And, I say 4 years, 4 days. He's 4 days old. He goes and he slays Python. Okay, so now these are similar stories. So why would John use these stories? Is it because John is making up a story because he's just making stuff up? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. He's using stories that they're familiar with to make a very specific point, right? So note that the Roman emperors associated themselves with the sun god Apollo, right? So, for instance, Domitian, he would say that he was Apollo born on earth. So he is the sun god, basically, right? These stories are used to show that not only is the emperor not a god who kills a dragon, he is actually actively working for the dragon, who is actually Satan, right? So, whereas Apollo, who is this god who is worshipped and everybody loves Apollo, and he kills the python dragon and all of this stuff, and then the emperor says, see, I'm Apollo and I've done all these great things. No, that is not the case. As a matter of fact, who defeats the dragon, who is Satan? It is actually Jesus. And he doesn't defeat him through battle. He defeats him through his sacrificial death, which has been a theme throughout the entire book, right? How does one conquer? One conquers by staying faithful to Christ even unto death, because that's the way Jesus conquered. Jesus conquered by being sacrificed, right? So that's the point, and that's why these myths are used in chapter 12. It is to show these people who want to worship these gods and the emperor that they have the story all wrong. It's not the emperor, i.e. Apollo, who defeats the dragon. It is Jesus who defeats the dragon. And the dragon is Satan, and the emperor and the empire are actually working for the dragon. They are puppets of the dragon. And that's the point, and that's why this background is so important. So then, at 12:4, his tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. So at this point, you should get that the child is the Messiah, right? The child is Jesus. But what are the fallen stars, right? So here we get another issue. So what do we do with the fallen stars? And the answer is not clear, to be honest with you. There are a couple of possible options. Maybe the second one is slightly more preferable. Note that in the Old Testament, stars sometimes represent believers, right? So in Genesis 26:4, you get this. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands, and in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. And then at Daniel 12:3, which is very important to the book of Revelation because Daniel is used a lot, and those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Right? So if this is the meaning, if these stars that are pulled down, if they are actually believers, then the point would be that the dragon causes these believers to turn, right? They turn against God and Christ because, again, they choose to accommodate because they don't want to suffer persecution on earth. So therefore, they decide to follow the dragon or the beast, i.e. the empire and the pagan gods and whatever it is that the empire wants them to do so that they can be comforted. However, generally in the book of Revelation, but not always, generally though, stars refer to angels, okay? So it is actually more likely that these refer to fallen angels, okay? And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but again, we've talked about First Enoch, and how First Enoch supplies some of the background for the book, and because again it was a popular book, it's again quoted in Jude 15 and 2 Peter 2:4, I believe it is. And First Enoch is an expansion of the sons of God who come down and have sexual relations with the daughters of men and all of that. And there are different interpretations of that don't involve actual fallen angels. But that's the way that the book of First Enoch interprets it, and many in early Judaism interpreted it. And so it uses similar language for fallen angels as stars falling. And so again, the point seems to be to use this as, not only does Satan end up falling, but he takes other angels with him And so, and then there's a battle. And so that seems, later on, it seems that pretty clear that that's the case. So it is most likely that the angels here actually represent, the stars here represent angels. I think I skipped a verse. Oh, no, I didn't. Okay. We had already done it. So at 12:5, she gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Note that in the Egyptian and Greco-Roman version of that dragon myth, the child is a god who defeats the dragon through combat and is worshipped by the world, right? And so that's a positive thing. That's why the emperor wants to be Apollo, because everybody loves Apollo and everybody wants to worship. But the twist here in the story is that child who was born actually defeats the dragon through the sacrificial death, and his followers are persecuted by the world, right? And so there's a twist on it. And again, much of the point of this is don't give in just because you're persecuted, because the dragon is actually already defeated, and we'll get to that in a minute. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days, right? Again, this 1,000, and we talked about this either last week or the week before. Again, the 1,260 days is the 3.5 or 3.5 year period used throughout the book. It is referred to as 1,260 days, 3.5 years, 42 months, and a time times and a half a time. A time being 1, times being 2, and a half a time being a half. And so you have 3.5. The time, times, and a half a time come from Daniel. Note that the persecution here starts immediately after the Messiah's ascension to heaven. So when you read chapter 12, note when all of this stuff happens. You have the dragon, i.e. Satan, and it'll come up here in a minute that it's clearly Satan. Satan tries to kill the Messiah, right, if we interpret the symbols. Tries to kill the Messiah. The Messiah is born, but then he is taken up to heaven, and then immediately afterward, persecution begins. And note, the people who are alive when this book is written to them are suffering that persecution. That's really the whole point of the book, is to say, look, I understand that you're being persecuted, but that doesn't mean that the dragon is somehow powerful. He is actually not powerful, and we'll go over that in a minute. But that persecution starts the 3.5 year period, which is ultimately the fulfillment of Daniel. That's what John sees as the fulfillment of Daniel, is this time between the first coming and ascension and the second coming of Christ. Again, that is the 3.5 year period, or it seems to be. There you have it. All right, so again, Daniel uses time, times, and a half a time, and it is also used in the book here. And I think it's used in this chapter. Interestingly, again, just for the record, when it's referred to as 1,260 days, it's a positive thing. It is a time of nourishment, okay? But when it's referred to as 42 months, it is a negative thing. It is a time of persecution generally. So we get this whole idea of the Messiah being born, right, in a highly symbolic manner, right? So we get all of that. Now the scene is going to change, as often it does in apocalyptic literature. If you read other apocalyptic literature, we are going to get the same scene repeated, but instead of it being on earth, we are going to get a heavenly representative of that, right, where it plays out in heaven. And again, like I've said before, the book, often it shows that things happen on earth, but then there's also a spiritual realm where those same things are going on, and there's things that we can't see. And again, Paul talks extensively about this, right? When he talks about the powers and principalities, and he talks about the spiritual world and the things that are happening all around us that we can't see. And that's what's going on here. So we get to verse 7. Now, war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. Why is Michael the one fighting? Because Michael is the prince of Israel. He is the one who is the guardian of he is the guardian prince of the nation of Israel. And that, again, also comes from Daniel. If you look at Daniel 10:13, it says this, "The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia." And then you get to Daniel 10:21, "But I will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. There is none who contends by my side against these except Michael, your prince." And he's talking to Daniel, who is from Israel. And then you get to 12:1, which is a big background for this passage. "At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people," again, Israel. "And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book." Note again that this in chapter 12, which shows Michael fighting the dragon, John sees that as a fulfillment of this passage. He is fighting the dragon concerning the whole Messiah situation, right? These two things happened at the same time. So then you get to 12:8. "But he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven." Note that the defeat happens at the exaltation of Jesus. When Jesus ascends to heaven and takes his throne, as we talked about before when we were talking about the, when we talked about all the comparisons with chapter 7 of Daniel, and I said there were 14 points of contact, right, where John clearly sees the fulfillment of that, where Jesus comes in chapter 5 and takes the throne, right? And so Jesus has taken his throne, and so this is the whole point, is that Jesus comes to heaven, takes his throne, he provides the opportunity for salvation for God's people, and at that point, Satan can no longer accuse God's people. And so what does that mean, that Satan can no longer accuse God's people? Well, he loses his access to heaven. And you say, well, he fell a long time ago. Well, if you look at Job, clearly in chapters 1 and 2, Satan comes to heaven with the divine beings who were there for a divine council meeting. It said that the sons of God came to present themselves before God, and it says Satan was with them, right? Note in the Old Testament, it's the Satan, it's the adversary is what Satan means in the Old Testament. However, again, in the New Testament, by the New Testament period, Satan has become a proper name. And so he loses that opportunity to go and to accuse people. If you read Zechariah 3, you have Satan standing next to God, and he is accusing Joshua, the representative high priest. And he's saying, you don't deserve another chance. No, you're done with. And God says, I rebuke you, Satan. Well, the whole point there is really they don't deserve another chance. And so Satan says, no, you don't get another chance. And God says, no, I'm actually going to give them another chance. So I rebuke you. It's the same thing here, where you have people who are being unfaithful. Satan will accuse those people, but now with sacrifice of Jesus and the offer of salvation through faith in Christ, he can no longer accuse people because all of their sins are covered by Jesus, right? So he loses that job, that prosecutorial job. And again, I know it's complicated, and I don't understand exactly how all that works. I mean, how does all that work? No idea, right? And there are books and books and books written about it. But he loses some sort of position that he has. As evil as he is, it's a position that he clearly has throughout the Old Testament. He cannot accuse those of sin who have their sins covered by Christ. Note that a place is prepared for the woman, right, who represents the faithful, but Satan loses his place, right? So then you get to 9. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who was called the devil and Satan. So there you go. Bam, it's Satan. The dragon is clearly Satan. The deceiver of the whole world, he was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Note that here his angels are thrown down, so clearly the stars seem to be angels. So then you get to verse 10. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. So in Jewish tradition, Satan, he he would accuse people 364 days out of the year, out of a 365-day year, and the only day that he couldn't accuse people was on the Day of Atonement, right? And so he is constantly accusing people over and over. That's in I believe in the Mishnah where it talks about that. Note that Satan is conquered and thrown down at the cross. That's when he loses his access to heaven. Whatever access and whatever position that is, he loses his access to heaven. It is only a matter of his final destruction that is left up for a future thing, right? And I mean, of course, he's on earth and causing trouble, but it's not sometimes we look at Satan, and we talked about this in Sunday school the other day. We look at Satan and God, and we give Satan way too much credit, and we think of Satan as though he's equal to God, and like, I don't know how this is going to turn out. No, Satan was defeated at the cross, right? And there's no doubt how it's going to turn out. And again, the book here, that's one of the major points, is that clearly Satan is going to be finally destroyed, but he's already lost. There's no chance that Satan is going to win out. So you need to get on the side that you know is going to win and stay out of the side that's going to lose. I guess I didn't put that over. At 12:11, hold on, let me look at that. Oh, who accuses them? Sorry, I didn't do that. I read it off my thing, that's why. Day and night, he accuses them day and night before God. So that, again, that's in the Mishnah, that it talks about that. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. And that is the message to those people in the first century, and to every person who's lived after that, is don't accommodate your Christian values. You need to stay faithful unto death. Again, how do Christians conquer? They conquer by remaining faithful in their witness even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. So note that you're going to have the woman and you're going to have the offspring. And he's after the woman and he's after the offspring, okay? So some people will say that the woman represents the church as a whole, right, or faithful Israel as a whole, and then the offspring will represent individual believers, right? Regardless of how you look at it, they both ultimately represent believers, okay? Note that Satan is thrown down to earth where he lashes out at the woman, i.e. faithful Israel. The point here is this: it may seem like Satan is powerful because there is so much evil in the world. There's so much evil going on, and we think, well, Satan seems to have the upper hand. However, that is not the case. The reason that there is so much evil in the world is because Satan is losing and has lost ultimately, and he knows his time is short, so he is lashing out like a wild animal, right? That's the reason there's so much evil. So don't think there's a lot of evil, so God must be losing out. No, that is not the case. The reason there's so much evil is because Satan is losing and he's lashing out, so just hold to your faith because he is going to lose, and that's the point. Craig Kester puts it this way: this scene is designed to shape the reader's responses to their social situations. If evil seems invincible, the natural response is to accommodate it. But if readers can see that evil is actually losing, they will have incentive to resist it, knowing that God will triumph in the end. So then we go to 12:14. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. So again, the time, times, and half a time from Daniel, right? Note that he pursues the woman into the wilderness, which it's funny because again, we think of wilderness. The English translation belies that a little bit. It is the desert, right? And there are wilderness areas in the desert, but it's the desert is where they go. This is going to look back at the Exodus from Pharaoh, where Israel was pursued by Pharaoh into the wilderness, right? They ultimately went to the wilderness. Again, John associates the time period with the time, times, and half a time of Daniel. The tension here is between the spiritual protection that the woman receives, but then the persecution that her offspring receive, right? So the eagle's wings are going to refer back to, in other places as well, but one place is Exodus 19:4. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So this is seen as another Exodus. This is a Exodus from spiritual death, right? The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep her away with a flood. So again, water is one of those debated things. Like, what exactly does the water mean? Note that water can represent any number of trials, including slander from the ungodly. If you look back at Psalm 140, it says this, "Deliver me, O Lord, from evil men. Preserve me from violent men, who plan evil things in their heart and stir up wars continually. They make their tongue sharp as a serpent's, and under their lips is the venom of asps. Guard me, O Lord, from the hands of the wicked. Preserve me from violent men who have planned to trip up my feet. The arrogant have hidden a trap for me, and with cords they have spread a net beside the way. They have set snares for me," right? So this is going to be slander and leading astray. Note that the readers from Smyrna might associate the flood with accusations which threatened them with imprisonment and death, because that's what it said to the letter to Smyrna. This flood could also represent the false teachings of Balaam and Jezebel, also in the 7 letters, which encourage people to accommodate Greco-Roman worship practices, right? So it's the mouth of the dragon which is emitting this flood, right? And note that in 16:13 through 14, it says the mouth of the dragon will emit evil spirits which will deceive, right? And so the flood coming from the mouth could either be slander toward Christians, which gets them executed or imprisoned, or it could just be the lies that like in the Eve incident, right? But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. So notice the earth comes to help. Note that the earth also came to the rescue, just as in the Exodus, where the drowning of the Egyptian army is described both as from water, but also from the earth. So if you look at Exodus 15:10, it says, "You blew with your wind, the sea covered them, they sank like lead in the mighty waters," right? So that's obvious because it's waters. But then 2 verses later, it says this, "You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them." So again, it's God's protection of his people. And then you get to 17, "Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea." So note that the rest of the offspring is faithful Israel, right? It's the church. And so the whole point there is, look, this is why Satan is attacking you. This is why you're being persecuted, because again, Satan is losing. And then when we get to chapter 13, it's going to spell out exactly how that persecution is going to play out. And again, it's going to be in highly symbolic terms, and we're going to talk about 666 and all of that. But very quickly, I have 3 minutes left, and I'm going to, very quickly, and I wanted to take a time to read it, but I'm not going to. But if you look up Saint Perpetua, she is one of the earliest female Christian writers, right? And she wrote a journal, and then unfortunately her journal had to be continued by someone else in the early church. I want to say she lived about 200 AD. And you look at all this and you think, I don't know, I mean, really, is it that bad if you don't worship the emperor? And really, is this really what this is about? Well, Saint Perpetua, she was martyred because she would not worship the emperor. And in her journal, you can read about it. She talks about how her father came to her and he begged her, just make the sacrifice. Just make the sacrifice. And I'm probably going to get broken up over this. So after she tells about her father and all these things and him begging her and them trying to get her to make sacrifice in front of the judge and everything. And then the continuation of her story is from someone else who talks about that she was put in the Colosseum, and they put the Christians there, and then they let bulls out on them, and then lions, and she was killed by a lion, right? And so this is for not worshiping the emperor. So when you look at this and you say, Joe, I don't know, I don't think I believe this, because this doesn't seem that bad, right? I mean, they refuse to refuse to worship the pagan gods or the emperor. Well, again, many of the early church martyrs, you remember what I told you, the vast majority of the martyrs in the 2nd century were killed for not worshiping the emperor. And so this is a serious thing. We don't look at it as serious today because we don't worship an emperor, right? But it was very serious back then. And this was a death penalty. And so again, we have different things that we deal with. We have different accommodations that we make to the empire when we sell out our faith for whatever comfort that we get here, right? But for them, this was very real. And this stuff is written to that 1st century audience who were dealing with real persecution. And I'm not just talking about, they got mad because, I don't know, whatever thing, happens with Chick-fil-A or whatever. I mean, these people were being killed by wild animals and stuff. And so, we have to take it very seriously. Again, it seems foolish to us because it doesn't happen today. But if you look over in foreign countries, this kind of stuff still happens. And it may not be wild animals, but it is being burned alive in cages or drowned in cages or whatever it may be. And so this is the type of persecution that they're dealing with. And it was a very serious thing. And so that's why all of this is used. Again, it doesn't mean as much to us today as because we don't think about worshiping pagan gods. But that's what they were being forced to accommodate their Christian values to worship these pagan gods, and it was a very serious thing. It wasn't just they would be unpopular in their town. It was you could be executed. And so again, that is the background, just for the record. And so I came across that story of Saint Perpetua. It's you can find that. It's the Christian History magazine is where I found it. You might be able to find her actual journal. Volume 17, and it had the whole journal and then the continuation. So I just wanted to throw that out there because there's a real world example of exactly the type of persecution that was happening in that time. Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.